Good morning. It's we're doing biblical generosity. What does the Bible tell us about money, giving, and a spirit of generosity? We are here with the Presbyterian Foundation's Joseph Moore, who is our regional coordinator, Ministry Relations Officer, to talk to us about biblical generosity.
Hey everyone, thanks Jason, and thanks to you all for coming. You never know with these sorts of things. So Jason said, all right, you got 30 minutes. And so I have maybe some directions we might go, but I also don't presume that I'm gonna just sit here and lecture, especially for
I do,
this.
so it's okay. They'll deal with
Like
it.
I'm much more interested in kind of a conversational, like, you've shared a little bit about why you're here. This interest in what does the Bible really have to say about money and giving, and but I'm curious if you're willing to share like why you're here and what you hope you might learn in
I'll
a
put
few
the
minutes.
camera on you.
Well, I would like to know what your interpretation of tithing is.
Okay,
And, is tithing enough?
sure.
And as you get older, you get to thinking about what money you have as compared to what money you need.
Yeah.
And, and what are the alternative uses for it? I've got a grandson that works for Young Life.
Mhm.
And they expect each of those people to raise part of their salary.
Yeah. Yep.
And, does that count? Giving to Young Life? Towards part of your tithing or
Sure.
all of those things. I've tried to do that in addition to tithing, but, just like to hear your interpretation
Yeah.
of what God's will is.
Well, I am grateful that you carved out just my interpretation, right? Which is not authoritative in any way. But the question of tithing comes up a lot in my work. So I'm a Presbyterian pastor. Like Jason said, I serve at the Presbyterian Foundation, where I've served since 2019. But prior to that, I've served as pastor in 3 different churches in Texas and Colorado. So I live in Fort Collins, which is the same state as this beautiful town, but a little bit far away because there's a bunch of mountains to get from here to there.
And you don't really live in them.
No, I live right on the edge. Yeah.
It's pretty tough.
Yeah. So yeah, in my work, I serve churches now from Colorado to Hawaii, because someone has to serve Hawaii. And these conversations come up all the time, right? Tomorrow, there's going to be a workshop that's much more focused on questions, especially dealing with later in life. What are some ways that church folks oftentimes set up remembering their church as part of their broader legacy, right? So that sort of end of life kind of financial stuff we'll cover more tomorrow. It used to be said that Jesus talked about money more than anything else. You might have heard that phrase where people have said Jesus talked more about money, or the Bible talks about money more than anything else. And it's not actually true. The Bible talks a lot about money, and Jesus did talk a lot about money, but Jesus talked a lot more about, what the world would look like if we followed in the way of Jesus. That was the language Jesus used a lot. Howdy.
Hey, how are you? Sorry I'm late.
No worries.
Sorry, Lake City.
Yeah. We really just got started. So the Bible has lots to say about money. It has lots to say that isn't always sort of in agreement with itself, right? Like lots of things in the Bible, the way the Bible talks about things and different writers of different books. And like the earliest language we have for money is a Hebrew word that the root of it actually has to do, it's the same root as to circulate. So it was this idea that money was not ever something that you just kept. It was this thing that was designed to move throughout a community. The Hebrew Bible talks, there's stories of the year of Jubilee and these ideas of every 7 years and every 50 years and different things where there were these resets of society, and we don't actually know that they happen very much. So it's one thing to say in theory, like, hey, this is great. The reality is we're not entirely sure that there was just this consistent practice where all debt was erased every so many numbers of years. But there is this idea in the all the way back in the Hebrew Bible that that money was designed to empower community. Like that was the function of it. Your question about tithing comes up a lot. And there's this Deuteronomy 14, 15, 16, I think, is one of the more famous sections that deal with all these different sort of if-thens about tithing. You know, if this, then that, if this, then that. And some of them are boring. But there's this, I think it's Deuteronomy 15. It's either 15 or 16. There's this amazing little sentence where the writer of Deuteronomy says, if you can't make it to the temple to bring your tithe, which a tithe was just a tenth of your first fruits, right? Sometimes I'm asked, well, is that before or after taxes? You know what? Whatever. Like, just start, right? Bible's not super clear. It's anachronistic to go back and say, well, that was before taxes, because they didn't really have, like, that was kind of the tax, right? But anyway, there's this beautiful sentence where it says, if you can't make it to the temple to bring your tithe, and like say you're a farmer and you've just got grain, it says sell your grain, so turn your grain into money. That's the phrase, and then throw a party for your community. And one of the things I love the most about that sort of obscure way of thinking about tithing is it points to what I think is a consistent theme, that idea of the tithe is always about how do you build up a community.
Or sharing.
Sharing, right? Same thing. And I think that language of sort of a tithe party, as preachers, like, there were kind of two purposes to the offering and then to a tithe. One was to sort of give back to God a portion of that which God has given us. But there's an aspect of, it's kind of wasteful to sacrifice animals that you could eat, to burn them, to just like, and I'm not saying that wasn't appropriate, that wasn't something that God was interested in. So that was a function of bringing things to the temple. But the other practical function of bringing things to the temple was, it was how you funded ministry, right? And so I don't get to answer the question authoritatively about your grandson, but is helping raise funds so he can engage in ministry an appropriate use of a tithe? I would think absolutely. Now, the Bible doesn't limit us to tithes, right? It's not, the Bible doesn't say only give 10%. I mean, for most of us, if we could even get to 10%, it would change the world.
Yeah, I heard a stat that most Presbyterians give between 2 and 3%, but because we're a more professional class of people, it's enough.
Yeah, so the average gift per member in the Presbyterian Church,
No offense to you non-Presbyterians.
yeah, the average gift per member for Presbyterians is actually $1,000 less per year than Christians in general in America. And Presbyterians were the second or third wealthiest religious group in the country. Jewish brothers and sisters, Episcopalians, and then Presbyterians. So Presbyterians, we do not have a toehold on generosity at all. But we do tend to be just across the board. There certainly is always contextually dependent. As the third wealthiest denomination, like, we do okay. But generosity is not, we don't do things like this as Presbyterians maybe as much as we should. Partly we're afraid in the Presbyterian Church to talk about money. We have this sort of Scotch, hardworking, like we just put our heads down, we do our thing, we don't talk about it, we don't talk about the good things we do. Oftentimes we don't talk about the bad things we do, and we certainly don't talk about money. And that's been to our detriment in the Presbyterian Church, and I would say in the Reformed Church in general. I think that's starting to change a little bit, but I think that this idea of the tithe as always being primarily about how do you build up a community, I think points us toward, and I don't want to distinguish between a Hebrew Bible way of thinking about generosity and a early church way of thinking about generosity, because there's not this artificial disconnect at all. In fact, I think there's actually a red thread that goes from this idea of sort of the tithe party to when you look at the early church. I mean, you've all read, I'm sure, Acts 2, Acts 4. There's this, I mean, it drives a lot of us crazy because it's so unrealistic. But there's a story in Acts 4, right, where, the Pentecost has happened and everyone's gathering and they've eaten and they're praying. And all of a sudden, Luke, the writer of Acts, says, and people sold everything they had and they brought and laid it at the apostles' feet. And no one had any need, which is one of the most beautiful and possibly unrealistic and naive verses in all of the
I
Bible.
tell them all the time they should do
Right? And so if there's a text that I think might be helpful to sort of ground as you think about, okay, what does it mean in my own life, in the life of my church? What does it mean to be generous? I think it might be that Acts 4 passage. So I want to read just a couple verses from it, because I think that it points to a way of thinking about generosity that's not a tactic. It's more of an orientation that kind of undergirds maybe and might help answer all the questions we might have about money in particular, right? So I'm more interested in, okay, what is the biblical theme or principle or idea that can undergird the way we just encompass thinking about our finances, money, what we do with our time. I mean, generosity, it originally, the word originally meant to wander outside the norm. It actually had nothing to do with money. It wasn't until like the 17th century when it began to be kind of put on wealthy folks who would give extravagant amounts of money. And we hear echoes of it today, right? When someone does something for you that's just extravagant or you don't know what else to say, sometimes we'll say, oh, it was too much, right? That harkens back to this idea that to be generous is to wander outside the norm. I mean, that's the root of the word. And I think that Acts 4 text, and so I'm gonna read just a couple of verses from it, because I think it's a text that sort of embodies this way of what if Christians really did live outside the norm. And stick with me, because I'm actually not going to argue that the only Christian response is to sell everything that you own and give it to the poor. I think there are some people. I think there's some people that's their call, but for most of us, I don't think that's our call. And I think I have biblical reason why I can say that. So Acts 4, just 3 or 4 verses. So you know the story. Pentecost has come, the Spirit, tongues of fire, all that stuff. We just celebrated this in church 6 weeks ago, whatever, 8 weeks ago. And then the church has started. And Luke writes, he says, when they had prayed, the place in which they were gathered together was shaken. And they were all filled with the Holy Spirit and spoke the word of God with boldness. Now the whole group of those who believed were of one heart and soul, and no one claimed private ownership of any possessions, but everything they owned was held in common. With great power the apostles gave their testimony to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and great grace was upon them all. there was not a needy person among them. For as many as owned lands or houses sold them and brought the proceeds of what was sold. They laid it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to each as any had need. That's the word of the Lord. And yeah, it's a text that a lot of times we read it and we think, oh, that's sweet, and then we move on. Because if that's the only passage that you read in the Bible, you would think the only faithful thing that I could do is to sell everything I have, to sell my cabin in Lake City and lay the proceeds at Jason's
Be
feet,
homeless.
right? And the reality is, if you read the next 20 chapters of the book of Acts, it is full of people who invite the apostles into their homes. People late in the book, primarily the women of the church, fund the ministry that's happening. None of which would be possible if the only faithful thing to do was to sell everything and lay it at the apostles' feet. That's sort of a one-time move, right? And it's true for 2,000 years, there's these amazing stories in Christendom where people have done that very thing. They've said, St. Francis, right? Great example. We're not all called to be St. Francis. And St. Francis had people throughout his ministry that enabled his ministry and made it possible. So I'm not trying to convince you that you have to sell everything that you own. I'm actually less interested in that line of the passage than I am in, there's this Greek phrase, and before they share anything, there's that line in the text that I just read, where Luke says that they were of one heart and soul. I don't know if you picked up on that. But it's a Greek phrase that was a euphemism for friendship. And before there was any financial generosity, before there was radical sharing of resources, the early church, one of the very first descriptions of the early church was they were described as friends. And I am, in the 6 years I've been doing this work and the almost 20 years as a pastor, I am more and more convinced that this idea of a community that's rooted in a generosity of friendship is actually the most powerful, most transformative, the thing that will most affect what we do with everything else in our lives, including our money. I also think in this day and age, it might be the hardest thing for us to do. It's interesting to me in this text from Acts 4, and this was a formative text for the early church. I mean, this was the kind of earliest painting of what it looked like for these new followers of Jesus to gather together. It says that they gathered and they prayed, right? That everything they did was rooted in a gathering in gathering together and in praying. And it's why Sundays are so important for us. Sundays on Zoom can be just fine, but Sundays in person, gathering together, praying, is where friendship starts. And it's interesting to me that it doesn't say that they were of one mind. It's not a text about obedience. It's not about theological or political agreement or disagreement. There's lots and lots of examples later in the book of Acts, and certainly in the epistles, where they don't agree on everything. But the earliest description of the church was they were described as friends. And so there's a unity that goes deeper than what I would say are shallow disagreements, even when they're important disagreements. This idea of one heart and one soul, it's kind of a root requirement of following in the way of Jesus. And I think it's where generosity starts. There's no absence of need in the early church until there's an abundance of friendship. And I think sometimes we skip over that because we can go to the part about selling everything you own and laying it at Jason's feet, and we understandably say, no way, like I'm not going to do it. And we skip over the language of friendship. And I think that this is a real point of, I think, transformative power for the church. I want to pause there and say, or invite you to share, what do you think about that idea? One, have you ever read Acts 4 and thought about it in this sense of friendship before there's any other kind of generosity?
Some of the strongest friendships that I have and have had over the years were in a neighborhood that we lived for 35 years. And we were all different religions,
Yeah.
but we all got together Christmas, Thanksgiving, whatever. If anyone was not going to someone's parents or whatever, we would get together. And it was it mocked what you're talking about.
Yeah.
You know, we would help each other out in any way.
Yeah. So there were these moments of generosity that kind of grew out of the
Right.
friendship piece.
Yeah, well, that's a sense of community. That was your community. And it's easy, don't take this the wrong way, but, I mean, it's easy to be generous with people you know, with people you see as like you. And you're empathetic to their situation, medical, whatever, lose a job, gonna lose their house, whatever. It is more difficult to give blindly. And especially if you're turning those resources over to someone else to trust in their judgment to use what you might want to perceive as appropriately, because it's my money, I want control,
Sure.
and I want to know what's going to the causes I support. Now, the big concern that I see in the church, not just Presbyterian church in general, has become more and more political. And now with the recent IRS ruling that's going to allow churches to direct fund political candidates and really start erasing those boundaries of church and state, I'm very concerned. And what's that? Church is already tough to sell to younger people, as you mentioned in your message this week. But boy, howdy, if we really start putting these, boundaries in there. But to answer the question is that, I've always thought that the tithing question is that a reflection of lack of faith? Can you, whether it's sell it all or give 10% or whatever, it's tough for a lot of people to do. And generally speaking, the more they go up the economic scale, the tougher it is for them to let go.
Yeah.
And
We know that is true.
Yep.
Like as a percentage of income,
it's disgraceful.
the wealthier you get, the lower the
They really
percentage.
have so much more discretionary income because their needs are met.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah. I wonder sometimes about that, if the higher up you go on the socioeconomic scale, the easier it is to be isolated from one another. Which is, I'm sort of making an argument for what I think Luke is making in this Acts chapter 4, that the easier it is to not have to be connected with one
you
another.
don't have to deal with it.
Friendship is not as important, right? I also think that,
But also the friends you have, they have the same Gulf Stream problem you have. It
Sure.
needs a new engine.
Sure.
It needs a new interior and, as opposed to let's build a homeless center or fund a med center in the ghetto,
yeah,
where we never go. We don't
That's
know
right.
anybody goes there or anything else.
yeah. I also, I just want to say one more thing and then we'll, I think that I do fully appreciate the idea of, you didn't use this language, but kind of local control is easier than like more broad. And I used to think more intentionally about the arguments for why the broader stuff mattered. And I do think it matters, but I actually think now, if churches could just engage in practices of radical generosity amongst themselves and in their particular communities, I actually think the Holy Spirit will take care of the rest. So I'm not saying that you're doing this at all. Like, I actually get the sense that this is not what you're saying, but I think sometimes we say, well, I have real concerns about my money doing X, Y, or Z, so I'm just going to hold on to my money. And I'm like, well, fine, let's not worry about X, Y, or Z. Let's just take care of A, B, and C here, right? And I actually think generosity is the sort of discipleship thing. I mean, I really think it's a discipleship trait in the same way that, mercy and grace and, I mean, the fruits of the Spirit, right? Um, that I think, fine, Christian. I mean, the reason there are hospital systems were because of churches. Like, I am so grateful that churches thought more broadly. Um, but maybe the church needs to spend a few decades just really cultivating generosity among itself again. And I say that because I think that if we did that, we would naturally find ways that are still wise and faithful and prudent to expand that beyond ourselves. But I think this idea of how do we practice radical friendship as the sort of the thing that undergirds our generosity and informs our generosity, I really do think the Spirit will take care of the rest.
And before you, Marshall, the thing that's interesting about our context here is that we are, although there are locals and that have to work heavily in the summer just to make ends meet, and we have Christian Community Service that gives to them. We talked about this at session this week, that if there's a need in the larger community, the churches all pool together and we work together to be a community service for the larger community. And if it's someone in our church, we take care of ourselves. Same sort of Acts 4 notion that you take care of your own before you ask the larger systems. But we're also a community of retirement and recreation, which means there is inherently generally more money, and the folks that we hang out with more money. I mean, I probably am one of the highest paid pastors in the town in decades. We are all in a place where there aren't major needs in our internal community, and really not a lot of major needs in our external community that really spill out over. So we're in this sort of vortex, which is what makes the Hiker Center so meaningful, is because there's not a lot of need here. We don't have a lot of poor. We don't have there's no need for social outreach. So we found something that did it. But I like what you're saying, going back to the friendship idea. And I think, Joseph, and I think that where I would sort of dig around in that is the social context of Acts 4 was not one where you worried about your retirement because your children were going to take care of you. Like, my mother's living with us now. It cost my mother nothing to live with us.
Yeah.
She could be spending $10,000 a month in a dementia care facility, doing it on her own, or we put her there. But in this case, it doesn't cost her anything. So my point in saying that, she doesn't have to worry about money. And that notion of, I think to reaffirm what you're saying, that idea that that they weren't, there were women who were opening their homes. Obviously, there were widows who had inherited. It wasn't bringing everything in so that you're poor and you don't have a home. I think it was the notion of you didn't need as much extra. There were no shops to go to buy. You only could buy so much food. Your lifestyle in that time and period only required so much money and currency in order to be able to function. So when the field was there extra, they're like, well, I bought this field. I wasn't going to do with this field. I'm not doing anything with it. That's the extra that I'm going to give to the church, so that there are others who likely were in need, not like in our context, could be received. So, I mean, I think the challenge, Ken, to your question, the idea is, no, I mean, I don't think that in our context it requires you giving everything, and I think a tithe, going back, I think a tithe is before the Holy Spirit was guiding. It was like, don't murder, don't steal, give a little to have a right relationship with your money. But I do think there is some sense of also in that Acts 4 passage that says Christ is coming back. And I've often said, if we knew Christ was coming back in a year,
How would we act
or
differently?
really thought Christ was coming back in a year,
Or we only had a year to live.
or we only had a year to live, all of a sudden that relationship and I think it's that fear, and in particular for retirement community, that fear of not having enough to care for you until you die, which again, sociocultural situation, if all of our children cared for us, we would never have that worry.
Yeah.
And 200 years ago, that was the norm. You didn't worry about it because you moved in with your family. So what we're talking about really is we're addressing a financial, we're addressing over and above a surplus of wealth in a largely artificial context in the history of humanity of having exponentially more excess income. You know, my mom's about to die. I'm about to inherit some money. I don't need the money. I don't need to live life, but I'm going to have it. And I'm wrestling with that. You know, and I've studied St. Francis. And I'm like, what do I just give it all away? And like, you know, Shannon would kill me, but I've had that. Sorry, Shannon. I've had that thought. Like, what are we called to? So anyway, sorry.
Yeah. Well, you've had a pressing
yeah.
question, and
Oh,
then
no, I have never really heard the word friendship with money. I know there's a concept there, but I mostly hear authority.
Yeah.
Do you want to address that? I understand you're saying the disciples were given what I would say authority over that money. So could you just address maybe what biblically authority in money?
Yeah. So that's a great question. I think there's a way to read the Bible that recognizes, and Jesus talked about this, like money in and of itself is neutral, right? It is just a thing. It is no thing. It is this idea. But Jesus recognized that money had the ability to have power over us. And so there's a way of combating the power that money inherently has, because we move from money as this earliest way of thinking in the Hebrew Bible is this thing that circulates, right? Like that's the root of it. We move pretty quickly to this thing that enabled me to have power because I had more than you did. And I think going on, I mean, you just alluded to this even in the Ten Commandments, this idea of we push back against the things that can have power over us as a way of taking away their power. And so I think there is, throughout the Hebrew Scriptures, and certainly in the New Testament, this pushback against scarcity, right? If the theme of the gospel, the heart of the gospel message is this abundant love of God and this idea that abundance is core to what it means to follow in the way of Jesus, then there's this resistance to the world that says you're not going to have enough, that there isn't enough, that you've got to hoard it all until that you build bigger barns because you don't know how much you're going to need until you die, and we don't know when we're going to die. And the Bible's really the story of resistance against that. And so I think one of the things that we do in communities is we create systems. I think the early church created systems where there was this idea as part of a resistance against scarcity was they said, we're going to come and lay this at the apostles' feet. I think there's also really good evidence early on that human systems get corrupted and the authority of church leaders was abused, right? But because money is something that is connected with power, there's always going to be questions of authority around it. I mean, in a lot of ways, I think the way Jesus talks about money, Jesus tried to neuter money. Like Jesus recognized money is impactful, it changes lives, it can change lives for the better, but it can also change lives for the worse. It can make deserts of our lives, partly because money can destroy relationship, which is why I think it's interesting to me that the earliest description of the church wasn't that they were described as generous first. That was like 4 or 5 sentences later. They were described as friends. And it was out of that friendship that all those other things grew. So when I hear authority, especially as it relates to the church, I am more interested in, okay, what are the power dynamics at play? And I think Jesus knew that money, there were inherent power dynamics with money. And then as human people, we always sort of gravitate toward, power's a thing. It's how we accomplish things. And I think Jesus really tried to resist that. I also think that, and that we've sort of gotten at this around the edges, it's really important to remember that Acts 4 group of friends, they were from all over the world, right? They barely knew each other. They probably in Acts 4 didn't actually understand the languages that they were all speaking, right? There was that moment in Acts 2 where the Spirit came and the mighty wind blew through and they all understood one another, but there's no implication that continued throughout the early church. So this was not a, lovely group of dentists and accountants and doctors at First Presbyterian Church, Fort Collins, right? Who all look the same and go to the same country club. Like, this was a messy, discombobulated group of folks that, again, the earliest description of them, these people following Jesus, they were described as friends, one heart and one soul. And I just think that if the church could figure that piece out, like, this might make you mad, but ignore money. Like, say, we're not going to think about money. We're going to think about, what does it look like for us to truly care for one another, treat one another in this radical way of being one heart and soul, which again is not of one mind. Like, I think the money piece takes care of itself. So for your friend, I think maybe I'm a naive preacher. I think the more closely I follow in the way of Jesus, the better parent I am, the better husband I am, the more generous person I am. But I need a community of people to hold me to some of those things, right? I need a community of people where, what was your name? Ken. Where Ken can tell me stories about his struggles with, I want to tithe, but I want to do it in the most faithful way. Like, I don't think about that question enough. I need to be in community with people who, in this really loving, you ask that question in the most unself-centered way you can imagine, or I can imagine. Like, that's the sort of community I think Jesus calls us to, because I need the Kens in my life who invite me in these really oftentimes gentle, sometimes subversive ways to think about, oh yeah, I try and tithe, but do I think about it broadly enough? Right? You didn't come in and sort of accuse me of not tithing in the right way. You shared with me a question that you're wrestling with in your own life. And even though we just met, like, I want to at least hope that you and I can be of one heart and one soul. And you have encouraged me to think more deeply about generosity. And you didn't do that intentionally. It's just what happens in communities.
I think the interesting thing about our community too is, I would say, like, I don't worry about money as the pastor. I mean, ever. I mean, Ken probably worries more about money. Certainly worry, but he's the treasurer, so that's his job. But I don't, because we have a very generous congregation, and we don't have a large. Our needs are not. I'm the biggest cost to them.
Yeah, your operating expenses are next to nothing.
Yeah, and so I think the challenge. But yet so in one sense, I'm glad you're here and saying these things, because I'm thinking about them like, well, how do they apply to our church? I think our church is generous. I think they give. I think we've had more than enough. For the last few years, we've had more than enough. There's nothing, that's restricting us. And I also think that we have people who, if I called upon them as a church as a whole, if there was any need from something outside of the community or something within our community, I think that they would step to the plate. I think the challenge for many of them, probably, I'm just speaking my own perception, is there are millions of dollars in that yard in people who are in their last 20 years of their life, because they were successful professionals and they were faithful Christians and they gave to churches for years and they're giving to our church now. But I think it is the question of, what does it mean to have more than enough in your final year, in your final decades of life, and to use that faithfully and responsibly. So you know that when you die, you're not just saying,
Yeah.
I'm gonna hand this on, but well done, good and faithful
Yeah.
servant.
Which is what we'll talk about tomorrow.
Tomorrow.
Yeah,
The-
which
more
is
the
much
legacy
more of
side.
that legacy piece. But I do think that's grounded in this generosity that I'm suggesting grows out of this radical way of thinking about friendship, but is ultimately cultivated in just following in the way of Jesus. Can I just read one thing? And I know
You're
it's
fine.
about
You're good. I had to go deal with the shuttle,
Mhm.
so I'm gonna leave you. When you're done, will you hit that?
Yeah. Yeah.
Stop, and then don't close it. It's gotta
Okay.
convert.
I just want to
And
read.
then don't go. I want to talk to you.
This is a letter that I received from, so I used to serve the Synod of the Sun, which is Oklahoma, Arkansas, Texas, and Louisiana. And there's an African American Presbyterian church outside of Baton Rouge, Scotland, the Scotlandville Presbyterian Church. That's a historic African American Presbyterian church. I think Condoleezza Rice's grandmother's church. Just an amazing group of people. They just celebrated their 100th anniversary. And I think that this is a letter I received from, it's actually a parishioner of mine whose mom is a member of that church. And my former parishioner's name is Peggy. And she sent me this letter that I think is one of the most beautiful descriptions of what I think generosity can look like in the church. And when I say in the church, I mean in any particular church. Peggy said this. She said, "As you know, my mom's church is a small church. For many years, they would have potluck dinners. My mom, Peggy's mom, does not brag on her cooking. She preferred to give Nedra some money to cover the cost of her gumbo." Peggy continued. "On the Saturday before the first COVID Thanksgiving, Nedra came by the house to bring Mom some gumbo. Nedra also brought her two grandsons. Grandsons do what grandsons do. They carried, lugged, toted the pot of gumbo from Nedra's car into the house and placed the pot on Mom's stove. Mom sent some over to the Stewarts, who live on the west side of her. She also sent some over to Tommy and Vera. Tommy's mother, Miss Davis, lived on the east side of Mom. Miss Davis is about 97. Tommy and Vera were visiting from Nashville. They were given fresh gumbo to take back to Tennessee. Kenneth had stopped by to do Mom's hair. He got gumbo to take to his wife and daughters in New Orleans. I asked Mom if she was going to send some gumbo to Miss Harrison, who lives in the next block. Mom said no. Nedra was planning on taking Miss Essex, another church member, some gumbo. Mom was sure that Miss Essex would send some over to Miss Harrison. Miss Essex will turn 100 in May." And she went on and on and on. And she didn't say it, but she could have ended her letter to me with, "There was not a needy person among them. For as many as had gumbo, they shared it with friends." I travel all over the country and am asked to speak at conferences and work with presbyteries and big churches and small churches. And they all want to know, like, how do you get people to give? And it is simple. It is as simple as that. If you have gumbo, share your gumbo. Like, we want to make it more complicated. Churches want to develop these intense strategies, sometimes which can be helpful. Like, we engage in a lot of that work at the foundation. But really, that's how you build generosity. If you've got some gumbo, you share it with your friends, and they share it with their friends. And that's how generosity is cultivated. You might think that is the most overly simplistic thing I've ever heard. I don't think it is. I think it started that way in Acts 4, and we're the same church today. We just need to live like it. So that's all I got. I mean, I've got more, but that feels like enough for this morning. But I'm happy to chat about like other questions. There's probably many things that I didn't touch on that you wanted to address. So, happy to chat, but
And you're going to address tomorrow?
Tomorrow's going to be focused on this idea of what are some ways that we see kind of across the church, church folks engaging and thinking about their legacy as it relates to a place after they die. So more plan giving related stuff. What are some of the primary ways that people think about making legacy gifts to their church? Why does this idea of legacy matter? Why does it matter theologically? I mean, I'm a pastor first and foremost, and I think the Bible is full of examples of legacy and people who made an impact, and what are some ways that we can think about that in our own lives? So that's a lot to cover in 30 minutes, but we'll do.
You're gonna cover that in 30 minutes?
We'll do what we can.
Make it an hour. It's okay, an hour and a half, 2
No,
hours.
Jason told me 30 minutes,
I
so
don't think you need to. He's, but the people who will be there, yeah, are willing to
yeah.
spend the time.
Yeah, I mean, I'll
You know, the message you just read to us about the gumbo, I mean, you know, certainly that is a wonderful